Hello, friends, and welcome to the Prepwell Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Prepwell Podcast. Today's episode, like many episodes, comes from conversations I've had with parents over the course of the week. It's usually about some difficult question or decision that they're grappling with, and they're asking me for some advice. Well, at some point, when enough parents bring up the same topic, it makes sense to raise this topic with all of you in the hopes that it might resonate with some of you as well. Today's topic revolves around athletes and college recruitment. And the question that kept popping up from parents is whether or not their child should consider switching sports from a more popular sport to a less popular sport, or a more competitive sport to a less competitive sport, or from a sport where the child's body type isn't ideal into a sport where their body type is ideal. The primary motivation being, would the switch give their child a better chance at getting recruited by colleges? And I'm not at all surprised that this has become such a hot topic, because competition to get into college these days, if you are not a recruited athlete, is becoming so arbitrary and unpredictable and unhinged from reality that parents are now paying even more attention to youth sports than ever before, if that's possible. The whole admissions process for the general population student, if you will, has become such a black box that is stressful and unsatisfying and disheartening that parents are throwing their hands up and looking for any way out of the vortex. And athletics is one way out. It's not an easy way out, but at least there's some transparency to the process, because today, being a recruited athlete puts you on a path that is at least partially anchored to reality, meaning if you get to the point in your high school career that you're being recruited for your sport, you will bypass most of the lunacy of the admissions process. You won't have to have a perfect SAT score or be the president of 4 clubs and volunteer 5.5 hours a week and have a 4.6 GPA and take 5 AP courses in a single year and win the Google Science competition. Many of those accomplishments, while admirable, will not be deciding factors in the end. Now, with this said, as an athlete, if you want to get into the more selective academic schools, this doesn't mean that you can slack off and be a crappy student, or skip the SAT and ACT, or disengage from other school activities. You'll have to do a lot of this, just not all of it on steroids. And this can be comforting for some students, because the idea of trying to do everything perfectly well, only to be rejected from most, if not all, of the highly selective schools is unmotivating at best and diabolical at worst. So many students are now doubling down on sports, where they can actually see the road ahead of them, figure out exactly where they stand, and get rewarded for being great at their sport. That's not to say that getting recruited for sports is easy or straightforward or inevitable, but at least you feel like you have a fighting chance if you hit certain milestones and you perform well. Which begs the question from parents, okay, I'm in. I want my son or daughter to get recruited to play sports in college. What do I do? Obviously, that's a much bigger question that we can handle in the next few minutes, but I do have a few suggestions. Suggestion number 1 is to subscribe to Prepwell Academy's athlete plan. That would be one way to make sure you're staying on track and not making any big mistakes. Suggestion number 2, listen to this podcast weekly. Suggestion number 3, find somebody like me to give you custom advice and recommendations specific to your child's situation. And suggestion number 4, and the topic for today's podcast, is consider moving your child to a different sport. What do I mean by that? Well, to play college sports A lot of things have to line up. And two of those things are, number one, your child's body type, and number two, your child's chosen sport. Let me explain. When it comes to body type, certain sports favor certain body types. And if your child wants to get to a high level in their sport, it would behoove them to have a body type that suits that sport. Let me give you an obvious example. These days, to be a mid to high level Division I male basketball prospect, your body type matters a lot. I'm not suggesting that it's the only thing that matters, because you could find exceptions, but it's a very key component. If you're a 5'10" basketball player in high school, even if you are phenomenal and scoring 30 points a game and garnering every award known to man in your region, the chances that any mid to high Division I level basketball program will pay attention to you are very slim. It almost doesn't matter how good you are, because at the next level, height and length become game changers. And chances are there'll be somebody with nearly the same skill set, but who's also 6'6". There's no way to get around that. The same could be said for a middle blocker in women's volleyball, where height really matters. Men's football, for example, relies very heavily on metrics. What's your height? What's your weight? What's your 40 time? And that will dictate what position or what positions you might fill. The higher the level of competition, the more metrics matter. And conversely, that same 6'6" basketball player may not be particularly advantaged on the lacrosse field, for example, where lateral quickness and explosiveness and craftiness and foot speed rule the day. So it cuts both ways. The moral of the story is, pay attention as early as possible to where you think your child's body will end up, their height, their weight, their skill set, and see if you can steer them into a sport where their physical attributes, what I'm calling metrics, will line up well with the sport they're playing. Obviously, this is not always an easy task. For one, sometimes it's tough to project where their bodies will end up. There are all kinds of surprises here, for good or for bad. And maybe even more difficult is trying to steer them toward a sport where their body fits best if they don't particularly like that sport. I'm not suggesting that if you have a son who lives and dies for basketball, but doesn't project to have the metrics consistent with top basketball prospects, that you force him to drop basketball and become a full-time lacrosse player in 5th grade, but you kind of want to force them, if you can, in a nice way. Now, you might be gasping right now. How dare you suggest that I stop my son from doing what he loves and try to steer him into playing a new sport that he's never played before just because his body isn't cooperating? I want my son to do what makes him happy. That's fine. That's a very appropriate and healthy response. And if this is your position, just don't be surprised when they come to the realization in 11th grade that they have no chance of playing basketball in college. And they get really depressed. And they wonder why their 5'9" neighbor has 4 offers to play lacrosse in college. I've seen this happen many times. Teenagers don't tend to look 5 or 6 years into the future. Parents do. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy, depending on your child. I'm merely suggesting that you put it on the radar. And I'll bring up a few more examples, some real-world examples in a minute, that hopefully will show you how this might work in practice. Now that we've talked about alignment of your child's body type with their preferred sport, let's switch gears to the sports themselves. When it comes to sports, some sports are more popular than others. Some are more accessible than others. Some are more expensive than others. And of course, some are more competitive than others. Normally, the more competitive sports like basketball and football have many more college programs available. So there are more spots available. But of course, not nearly enough spots for the number of students who aspire to earn one of those spots. So as a parent, you'll want to think to yourself, okay, I know my daughter is really good in soccer, and she's been playing for 10 years, and she's made every all-star team, and is on every elite, gold, platinum, select, supreme club team. but soccer is a very competitive sport. It's everywhere. It's in every single town across the country. And there are a lot of other talented female soccer players out there who are vying for not so many spots on college teams. So is it a good bet for me to think that my daughter will be one of the chosen ones? Well, I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know the specifics of your daughter. What I do know is that the funnel gets very small at the top as she works her way through high school. And statistically, she will not make it through to that very tiny hole at the top of the funnel. She may, but it's very unlikely. So do you consider the idea of shifting her to a different sport with more realistic recruitment prospects? The moral of the story here is to be aware of the recruiting landscape for the sport that your child is operating in. Sports like basketball, volleyball, soccer are very competitive. Again, I'm not suggesting that your child is not. I just want you to start thinking about these things in 6th grade and 7th grade before they lock in so deeply. Which brings us to today's topic, which is, does it ever make sense for my child to switch sports midstream in order to increase their chances of getting college attention? Of course, there's no clear answer for this, but let me offer some questions to help you figure this out. Question number 1, how good is your child? I know this is tough to do as a parent, but by 8th or 9th grade, you should have a pretty good idea where your child is projecting in their sport. If you're savvy about the sport and have some related experience, you probably have a gut feel. If you don't know enough about the sport, talk to someone who can evaluate talent and ask them if your child has any chance of playing in college and at what level. Most of the time, the answer is clear. Second question, does your child have metrics? By this I mean, do they have the physical attributes that will be favorable to their sport at the college level? We never quite know in 8th or 9th grade because children pop physically at different times, but usually you can make an educated guess. Again, the extremes are easier to deal with. If your son is 6'6" in 8th grade, chances are the metrics will be good as a basketball player. The same for your 6-foot daughter in volleyball. Now, if your son is 5 foot 5 inches in 8th grade and has full leg hair on his calves and shin area, and you're 5'9" as a male or 5'3" as a female, then basketball is probably not a great match. It's easier to determine where your child stands in this area if they play a sport that likes extreme metrics in their athletes. And not every sport does that, so you have to think about that. Question number 3, does your child have the mentality? Even if your child is a national talent and has metrics, you still have to wonder if they have the mental makeup to succeed at the next level. Once again, it's easier at the extremes. The psycho kids who wake up at 5 a.m. to run and work out and have a protein shake, they're probably on the right path. Versus the equally talented athlete who has to be bribed to put in any additional work. It's the athletes in the middle who are tougher to nail down. Question number 4, what sport do they play? If they play a wildly competitive sport, you have to be even more honest with yourself with all of these questions. In some of the niche sports, there may be some wiggle room, but in the big traditional sports, there's not a lot of room for error, and the recruitment process can be very unforgiving. And lastly, question number 5, what sport would they switch into? This is a tough one with a lot of caveats. When are they making the switch? Have they ever played the other sport before? Do they have good metrics for that sport? Ideally, it's a sport where your child's natural talents and skills and metrics mesh well. It would be great if they've played it before, even a little bit. If it's a highly skilled or technical sport, like fencing or diving or swimming, where it takes years of training to get up to speed, then it might be a tougher road. If it's a sport like rowing or field hockey or lacrosse, where all-around athletes tend to do well, then maybe there's an opportunity there. And to bring this back to reality, I'm going to offer 2 examples of student athletes who switched sports midstream and were successful in the transition. And with these case studies, you can imagine how your son or daughter might do the same thing with their set of facts. One of the examples happens to be my son. Growing up, he played multiple sports. He played basketball and soccer and some baseball and lacrosse. And as he moved into 6th and 7th grade, lacrosse became his thing. He made all the teams, and the select team this and the elite team that, and went to the World Series, the whole shebang. And he assumed that he would eventually become a college lacrosse player. And by the time he got to high school, he had decided to drop every sport except for lacrosse. Then, when he started his freshman year, he decided to try water polo in the fall in order to get out of his school's PE requirement, because you had to play a sport to get a free period for PE. In addition to this, I will have to admit, I did have some influence on him giving water polo a try, as I knew deep down that water polo would ultimately be his best sport. Now, how did I know that? Well, I paid close attention to his skills growing up. He had good court sense from playing so many different team sports. He knew about triangle offenses and give and goes and setting picks. He was good in the water. Maybe not great, but he had a lot of upside. He had very good eyesight. He was a good passer. He anticipated well. And maybe most importantly, he was left-handed and projected to be about 6'5". Now, mind you, at the time, he was only 5'11". So this 6'5" business was just an educated guess, a hope and a dream. Now, if you know anything about water polo, being a left-hander and tall are two big advantages. It's nice to have a lefty on the right side of the goal, and height is a big deal because you can create separation from your defenders and be a menace on defense by disrupting passing lanes. Water polo was also a sport that advantaged athleticism and a work ethic to become a strong swimmer. And I happen to think that my son fit the bill on those two scores. Thankfully, he took my advice. And after his first season ever playing water polo in the fall of his freshman year, he dropped everything and became a full-time water polo player. Now, that's not to say it was easy giving up on lacrosse. He had thousands and thousands of hours of practice invested in that sport. There were a lot of sunk costs. But after discussing the longer-term prospects of playing lacrosse versus water polo in college, he eventually understood that this was probably the best bet to make. And it was a big bet. He was turning away from 9 years of lacrosse experience for 0 years of water polo experience. In fact, he wasn't even that great his freshman year in water polo. But the metrics don't lie. And as it turned out, this happened to be the right call, because he is now a junior and 6'7" and still a lefty. And he's become a very highly recruited water polo player at all the top water polo schools. And hopefully, he'll keep his head down and perform well in school. And eventually, he'll have a lot of options next year. And hopefully, this will be a success story. But I shudder to think what his experience would be like as a 6'7" lefty lacrosse player if he never made the switch. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it wouldn't be ideal for his college prospects, and it wouldn't be putting his metrics to their highest and best use. Here's one more example. A girl who was also a multi-sport athlete growing up, mostly soccer and basketball, phenomenal in both, but soccer was really her go-to sport. She lived in a very soccer-centric town that cranked out nationally ranked teams every year, and she assumed that she would get on the soccer train and take it all the way to college. As she entered freshman year in high school, she was very well positioned to be one of the few freshmen to ever make the varsity team because the talent was so deep at the school, and it turns out that she did not make the varsity team. In fact, she was asked to play on the freshman team. And that was a shock to the system, and it caused her to really reevaluate her priorities. And so she opened her mind to other possibilities and came to the conclusion that maybe soccer wasn't the right fit for her after all. She made a tough decision and decided to leave soccer behind and instead play field hockey, a sport she had never played before. Well, lo and behold, her speed and athleticism and IQ and timing translated very well to field hockey. She needed a little extra work to pick up on her stick skills, but once she got familiar with that, bam, she was off to the races. She became the best field hockey player on the team, and would have become a very highly recruited field hockey player for college had she not also tried out for the track team in the spring. She had so much success trying a new sport with field hockey that she thought, why not try her luck as a 400-meter sprinter on the track team? Well, you guessed it, in her freshman year, without ever running track before in her life, she placed 8th in the country at nationals out of the top 52 female sprinters. This came completely out of nowhere. She had no idea she had this type of hidden talent. She's now a senior and a very highly recruited track athlete who will be attending her pick of some very selective colleges, including several Ivies. Now, these are just two examples of athletes who, quote unquote, made the switch. And by all accounts so far, it's worked out. But I don't want to suggest that this is easy or guaranteed in any way, shape, or form. These two athletes might be outliers because I tend to work with students like this. In every case, managing a switch like this midstream is a very fine balancing act and fraught with pitfalls. But don't forget, so is staying the course. So is the status quo. There is no guarantee. So let me review the factors you should consider. Number 1, I would start thinking about where your child might project in their primary sport as early as 7th or 8th grade. By then, they should have a big enough body of work for you to assess their longer-term potential. It might not be super obvious by then, but I'd be looking hard at it. Number 2, I would then be honest about their metrics and whether their metrics will help or hurt them down the road in their target primary sport. And I know this is tough to predict, but most people have a pretty good idea. Number 3, I would then be honest about the competitiveness of their sport. If they're a basketball player and they want to be a mid to high Division I level prospect, you will probably know that by 8th or 9th grade. Don't assume that they have 2 or 3 more years to develop. In a sport like basketball, unless there are extenuating circumstances, the die has already been cast by then. There are other sports that students can pick up later, even starting in high school, like rowing, for example, but there aren't that many. Number 4, if you're not sure about their prospects, ask a trusted advisor for their honest opinion, preferably somebody with decades of experience of assessing high school talent. Number 5, I would then be honest about how good an athlete your child is. Transitioning to a different sport midstream is very difficult and is likely only going to work out if your child has extraordinary athletic talent that is also highly transferable. There's no litmus test for this, but you can normally see this from a mile away. Remember, in most cases, they will be competing against athletes at the top of their game who have specialized in the sport for 10 years. This is a lot to overcome starting midstream. So your child needs to be a stud. Number 6, what sport might they switch to? What is the competitive landscape for that sport? How much ground will they have to cover to catch up? Are they interested in the new sport? Do their metrics align better with the new sport? What's the recruiting landscape for the new sport? Does their mindset align with the new sport? Are they going from an individual sport to a team sport or vice versa, which can be tough? And number 7, and lastly, if you think the switch might be appropriate, what does your child think about the switch? You don't want them to have PTSD after dropping their sport and friends and relationships. So once again, understand this is a consequential decision. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because it's my belief, and I've talked to other parents who feel the same way, that there are a lot of talented athletes out there who may be the 3rd or the 4th player off the bench on their elite soccer team, for example, but who would be all-American field hockey players. Or they're a pretty good swimmer, but would be a much better water polo player. There's a lot of hidden talent out there, stuck in the rut of what they've been doing since they were 4 years old, who might be better off taking their talents and switching gears to a new sport. In fact, let me give you some examples of some sport switches that might make sense. Number 1, basketball to rowing. Very similar body types. Long, lean, tall, good biomechanics. This is a very viable switch. I was a basketball player in college, And the rowing coach was always trying to pick off my teammates and me to move over to rowing. Plus, the rowing skill is relatively easy to pick up because most kids don't start rowing in second grade like they start playing basketball. They normally get introduced to the sport much later. So the gap is easier to make up, especially if you have the metrics and the mindset. What about football to lacrosse? This is a very common switch because it's easy to get lost on a football team, especially if you don't have wicked metrics or wicked strength. And there are so many positions. The roster is huge and it's hard to stand out. However, if you're pretty good at football and you have a football mindset and you invite contact, you might make a mean two-way midfielder in lacrosse, especially if you have a motor and you don't mind contact. What about soccer to field hockey? You bet, just like the example we just talked about, there are probably thousands of female soccer players who would be better off switching to field hockey or lacrosse because they're less popular sports. They're less developed, and there's more room to catch up and excel. What about swimming to water polo? We just mentioned that. This happens all the time. If your swim times are starting to plateau, maybe you're getting burned out, maybe try water polo a few times and see what you think. That solid swimming base may shoot you to the top of the water polo team, especially if it's combined with good metrics. What about basketball to lacrosse? If height is not your thing, but floor awareness and eye-hand coordination and endurance are, you might make a crafty attackman or a shutdown defender in lacrosse. And even though lacrosse is starting to get more and more popular, it's nowhere near as competitive as basketball, not even close. So maybe you can carve out a special spot on the lacrosse field. What about football to track? If you have lightning speed, but you don't project to have the weight or the strength to excel in college football, or you don't like the contact so much, why not give track a try? As you might guess, not every sport switch would make sense, obviously. For example, I'm not sure you're going to go from golf to football. That would probably not be a great smooth transition, but I think you get my point. So as your homework tonight, I want you to think about these questions. Question number 1, does my child want to be a recruited athlete coming out of high school? Yes or no? If yes, how do their metrics align with their primary sport? Do they align well, poorly, or not so well? Question number 3, what's the competitive landscape like in their primary sport? Not competitive, somewhat competitive, or extremely competitive? Number 4, do they project to have what it takes to get to that level, where colleges will be clamoring to recruit them? Yes or no? And lastly, question number 5, if the answers to these questions are leading you to think that their chances are slim or slim to none to play their primary sport in college, then the question is, should they try to transition to another sport? And that conversation can be a lively one. My suggestion would be to listen to this podcast with your son or daughter and have a mature conversation about how their high school athletic career might end up and what their options are. Ideally, you would have this discussion sooner rather than later. I'm talking 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, maybe 9th grade at the latest, because the longer you wait to transition, the further behind you'll be, and the more time it will take to get you up to speed and beyond. If you've had a similar experience in transitioning sports, good or bad, I'd love to hear from you and learn how you approach the issue. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support. If you know a parent with a 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grader in high school that might find this helpful, please share the episode with them. You can do that by finding that small box with a tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button. Text your friends a link to this episode with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. Of course, if you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, I'm all ears. Reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn, because I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to prepwellacademy.com and enroll your child today.